So the methodology that I explained before, these are the results that came out from this. So just to remind you of the process without going into too much detail, because I hope I went into sufficient detail before, I used ArcMap combined with Homer to perform some least cost optimization simulations. So once this was done, this was input into a Python code of my own making, and then this output some maps based on the least cost system design. So straight into it, the simulation for the residential mini-grid of 25 kilowatt hours per day average demand, with the load profile shown up here. This is the result. This is the map of the result. And to briefly explain it, the yellow areas, the system architecture recommended is PV only. So it's a PV only mini-grid. For the small amount of orange you can see in the hilly areas, it's recommending PV combined with a small amount of diesel. Now, when I mentioned that there's diesel included in the mini-grid, people can be a little bit concerned about that, but there is a constraint on the simulation that makes it so that 90% of all generation will be renewable, whether that's wind or solar. So only 10% is allowed to be diesel at any point. The blue areas, if you can see them, there are a few, but they're quite small and scattered. These are the areas that recommend only PV and wind hybrid systems, so no diesel. The green areas, which there are quite a lot of, are recommending PV and wind and diesel, so diesel in a supporting capacity. The precise number of wind turbines, the precise number of PV panels, they vary across the country, obviously, by location.
I'm worried about the transportation of diesel to these
Yes.
areas.
Yeah. So how I modeled diesel costs by location, I considered the diesel price within cities and then the transportation costs. So the transportation costs for the remote areas are implicitly included within the model. Although the variation may be more than what's seen here. If that doesn't assuage your worries too much. So this is for the residential only mini-grid with the residential load profile. If we move over to the productive end users mini-grid, we can see quite a difference. There seems to be a much greater potential for PV and wind hybrid systems. There seems to be much greater potential for wind in general. So this load profile is based on a real mini-grid with a furniture mill used for productive end uses. And
potential higher in the northern region of Nepal?
The wind potential, sorry?
Solar PV. Solar PV potential.
Solar PV. Yeah, that's true, but...
Yeah, so why did we just recommend PV only in the lower region?
No. There's PV recommended at every location in Nepal. The green areas are PV and wind and diesel, so all three in a hybrid system. The blue areas are PV and wind. The orange areas are PV and diesel, and the yellow areas are PV on its own. So every location is recommending that for a system of this design, PV should be included.
So just in case in the bottom area, there is only PV, right? So if you could recommend diesel and PV in the India border area, that would be more PV.
Yeah. So the difference between these things is based on the diesel price, the solar cost, and the wind resource only. So that those are the three things that are varying by location that have allowed this simulation to be performed. Does anyone have any more questions about this? Okay.
What's that 130 kilowatt per hour?
So that is the average daily demand of the mini-grid, the entire mini-grid. So including residential components and including the productive end use. So previously the simulation was performed only for a residential grid, and that was why the low demand was in the profile that it was.
Excuse me. So yeah, in orange areas, right, you consider diesel because PV will be enough, or
So there is potential to not consider diesel at all, but in the locations where diesel is considered, we find that the price of the mini grid decreases a lot, by a significant amount. And I imagine that's to do with the fact that the use of diesel can dramatically reduce the necessary requirements of the battery. And the battery is the bulk of the cost of the system.
like the southern regions?
Sorry?
Yeah, the southern regions, right?
Uh-huh.
Where you mentioned only PV.
Mm-hmm.
Is the PV resource enough?
That's what the simulation and the maps I'm using are saying. Yeah.
So, why is the map different as the demand differs?
Why is the benefits of scale? So the benefits of scaling, if you have one wind turbine, if you have one solar panel, they're quite difficult to, they're not economical to maintain. They're not economical to be part of the system. But once you scale the system up, there's more space for variety amongst the system. There's more space for diversity of generation, for example. And the more diverse the generation, the more complementary the resources could be, and the less stress there is on the system as a whole. So I think I discussed this map with you before. This is taking the nighttime light pollution data from NASA satellites and producing a buffer pattern around them. So the red lines again are the grid lines, and the red and yellow pixels are nighttime light pollution hotspots. And so using these, we can generate a buffer which produces an inclusion and exclusion zone for the areas that we assume are electrified or a priority for future grid electrification, and the areas we can consider as being off-grid. So this is a map of the recommended number of turbines by location, by optimized mini-grid in each location. Once this has been normalized by the population, we can see that the darker blue areas are the areas where more turbines are needed. The lighter blue areas are where less turbines are needed. So we can start to see some hotspots emerging here. By calculating the total, by summing the capacity of all these wind turbines, we see that there's 110,000 kilowatts of small wind turbines recommended for this case. Now, when I say this with the caveat that if this were the case, we'd have residential mini-grids everywhere, and obviously that won't be the case. This is just a brief guideline. And in doing so, in installing this capacity of wind turbines along with solar and or diesel, then 283,000 people would be electrified by this in these mini-grids. And moving on to the industrial and mixed mini-grid, you can see here that more turbines are recommended. There's a slightly higher capacity of wind turbines recommended, and there's also quite significantly more people included in these mini-grids. Now that's because in the productive end-use mini-grids, the mixed industrial mini-grids, it's often recommended that there's a higher proportion of solar to a small amount of wind, due primarily to cost issues, I think. And then so taking this sort of data from here and here, we can generate hotspot maps. So this has been produced by a clustering algorithm, which has clustered high magnitude pixels together where they're concentrated. So we can start to see areas where these kinds of mini-grids should be implemented or could be feasible to implement at scale. So it's hoped that this kind of image and the image that will follow for the productive end-use mini-grid will help inform people of likely regions for success. bearing in mind that these are regions that are only within the the area that we expect to be off-grid. There may be further hotspots in areas that are grid connected or within the electrification zone. So if we just look at the difference between these two, more hotspots for productive end users, mini grids, larger hotspots. So the recommendation here is that the larger the mini grid, the more viable wind turbines would seem to be in the mix. What reasons that would be, we can analyse those a bit further, but this is simply the output from the simulations that I performed. So again, it's hoped that with these kinds of maps, recommendations, APC, other partners will be able to investigate these areas and to some extent validate what we've done, or not, as the case may be, but I'm fairly confident with what we've done. So a conversation we've touched upon briefly before is the effect of the logistical effect of things. So Nepal obviously has quite a widely varying topography, which makes transportation, maintenance quite difficult. So by using the accessibility map, which maps travel times from a city of 50,000 people or more to different locations, we can use this and combine it with operations costs as produced by Homer. So that's what this map is. So you can see the green areas are connected together by the roads. The green areas are areas where travel time is lower. Red areas, more remote, travel time is higher, and the operations cost will be assumed also to be higher. We haven't been able to include this kind of variation explicitly in the Homer simulation yet, because Homer doesn't allow the flexibility for such things. I'm hoping that in the next month, 2 months, maybe 3 months, that I'm going to be able to model this explicitly and include this in the least cost simulations. Because obviously installing a wind turbine in a very remote area, wind turbines require a lot of maintenance. It's going to be difficult. The cost is going to rocket. So we need to be careful about that. So this is a map of the cost of energy as simulated by Homer. Now again, this doesn't account for the transportation costs in remote areas. But what can be seen is that comparing with the maps I've shown you previously in the hotspot maps, the cost of energy in areas where wind turbines are included is lower. You can draw your own conclusions from that. What I believe it to be is the complementary production with solar, reducing battery costs. But obviously, if the maintenance is higher than expected, that cost is going to increase. So that needs to be modelled a bit further. So, as I mentioned before, solar PV is recommended at every location, but less solar PV capacity is obviously recommended in locations where wind is recommended. And so this is a map of the number of PV, the capacity of PV recommended in each mini grid by location. So the red areas are higher capacity, the yellow areas are lower capacity. And again, if we just compare briefly these two maps, you can see quite clearly that the lower cost areas are also where there are fewer solar panels. So that could be the case that there's a higher solar resource, it could be a case of wind turbine inclusion, it could be a combination of those two.
Why do you recommend smaller size of solar than wind turbine?
That's no. Some of these maps may be misleading. In almost every mini grid, there is it's recommended that there is more solar than wind. Again, based on cost. Even when there's quite a high wind resource, it will be the case that the cost of solar and the solar resource in that location makes solar in and of itself more cost effective. But it's the combination, it's the playoff between the two generation.
You compare the upfront investment as well as the operational maintenance cost. Solar will be obviously cheaper.
Yeah.
Then again, what is the energy yield? It is also comparable.
Well, the energy yield in the simulation, the energy demand will be met at all times for every system. That's one of the constraints on the system. Obviously, again, not modelling the reliability and downtime, which could be quite a key factor, especially with wind turbines. But there is some further analysis on that. I think Kimon is going to present later, so that's a good point. Okay. So the conclusions I've drawn from the maps and the simulations have produced, larger systems with semi-industrial load profiles seem to be more suited to the inclusion of wind turbines. The hotspots for wind turbine implementations have been identified for both mini-grid system cases, and the potential for wind turbines in both cases has also been quantified. Again, as I was saying, the inclusion of wind turbines seems to reduce the cost of energy. Whether this is the case or not could be debated, given that the maintenance and transportation issues weren't explicitly modelled. There was an average value for operation cost included in the simulation, but obviously this won't be uniform across the country. This will vary by location, and this needs to be simulated as well, but this hasn't been achieved yet. All these results and more, hopefully, will be included in the final project report, which will be released within the next 6 months. So the intention is we have all of your emails. We will send you the final project report when that's completed. Okay. And the future work which I intend to do before the project report is written, the inclusion of hydropower in the mix, so we can consider competition not only with the grid but also with hydropower generation, explicit model of maintenance cost, the considerations of individual component reliability. So at present the model is considering how reliable the wind turbine system is, but that's not really the question we should be asking. We should be asking how reliable the generator is, how many times does the tower break down, how many times do the blades break, how many times does the wind controller fail, or the inverter, and so on and so on. And so by explicitly modelling each of these components, we can get a better idea of the reliability of the whole system, rather than just sticking a fairly arbitrary reliability value onto the system as a whole. And again, I think Kimon is going to talk a little bit about component reliability. And then, for sake of validation, comparison of our results with the existing sites, and to see whether what is observed in the sites agrees with what we've found through the simulations. If that's not the case, we need to revisit the simulations. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And I think briefly, if anyone has any questions.
This is you say hydro inclusion in the research. Mm-hmm. How about the micro hydro inclusion?
When I said hydro, I meant to say micro hydro. So we're talking about off-grid hydro generation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So there is quite a distinction. I know I should have been clear on that. Which map?
Accessibility map.
Okay. This one, yeah. So this map isn't entirely of my own making. This map has been, there is a global accessibility map online which has been generated by considering speed limits on roads, average travel times on roads, and difficulty of traversing terrain without roads, so walking. So this was generated, I think, in 2006. So it's quite obvious that there'll be new roads by then. But broadly speaking, the infrastructure will be, the major infrastructure will be the same. So smaller roads will be added, but the major infrastructure, unless I'm completely wrong, will be broadly the same. It would be possible for us to generate this map again, and that might be worth doing with new road data. But if I do quickly go into GIS. So, this is the same. Right, sorry. If I just end now. There we go. No. I've got something different on this screen than this screen. Anyway, I'll talk about what's on this screen so you understand. Sorry, what was your question? The green areas. So the green areas are, that's a low travel distance from a city, basically. So the green areas, you can see these lines, they're roads, major roads. Smaller roads have been modelled as well, but they're harder to see on this map. Red areas, more remote, and everything in between. And again, this data is completely open source. I think it was generated in a UN, can't remember which department, but it was a UN project that developed this, and the coverage is the entire world, as with all data that I've used. Right, any other questions before I finish? Great, thank you very much.
All right.
I think so. I'm just trying to see.